In a universe where war is pretty much a constant of life, you can expect there to be a great many styles of combat in circulation. Most people are aware of lightsaber combat, or ranged combat, or variants there within. But the basic, universal type of combat often goes unmentioned when Star Wars is discussed: hand-to-hand, unarmed combat. But just because it isn't mentioned doesn't mean it isn't there. In this video, we'll be looking into the matter of unarmed combat in the Star Wars universe, and in particular, the role it played for the clone troopers of the Galactic Republic.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
One would think that, for clones intended to fight an army of droids, hand-to-hand combat would be rather superfluous. After all, it's hardly a good idea to just up and punch something made of metal, which a certain trooper that died on Christosis apparently didn't know. But there's more to combat than just blunt force, and there were indeed ways for unarmed combat to be used against droid without self-injury, though there weren't as many as could be employed against living beings. Clones didn't use unarmed combat all that much, but they were absolutely trained in it. After all, any soldier worth his or her salt knows some style of unarmed fighting, if only for use as a last resort, and there are actually quite a few unarmed combat styles in the Star Wars universe to choose from. Most species and cultures had their own traditional forms of unarmed combat, some of which rose to prominence on a galactic scale. Among the foremost of these was the art of the Echani, a species of near-humans that was renowned for their combat skill. The Echani elevated combat of all kinds to ritual importance, especially unarmed combat, which they believed was the best way to understand a person. Echani combat was heavily structured and had a strict code of etiquette, as the Echani considered unarmed combat to be a form of close personal communication. In general, Echani styles were aimed at turning the whole body into a weapon, a potentially deadly weapon. Heavy emphasis was placed on balance, speed, and precision in particular. Stance was very important when practicing Echani combat styles, especially in regard to footwork, and in particular, Echani warriors tended to circle their opponents. Thematically, it was somewhat similar to Form 2 lightsaber combat in this regard, and in its emphasis on precision over brute force. A vaguely similar but much less ceremonial style of unarmed combat was Stava, a technique developed by the Noghri of Honoghr. Named after one of Honoghr's fiercest predators, Stava emphasized speed and endurance, crucial traits that allowed the Noghri to dominate their world's ecosystem. This technique, as well as other combat skills that the Noghri eventually adapted, helped make Noghri warriors some of the greatest combatants in the galaxy, to the point where the Empire made exceptions to its humanocentrist doctrines to allow for Noghri bodyguards. Stava was a hunter's form of unarmed combat, a style that encouraged rapid, evasive maneuvers that allowed skilled practitioners to dodge even blaster bolts, while also providing maximum offensive prowess. Nerve pinches, joint locks, exploitation of pressure points, and quick strikes were all hallmarks of Stava. It was similar in a few ways to Echani style, though there were many notable differences, especially in that Stava practitioners usually went right for the kill, as the Noghri had no use for extended duels with their prey. Perhaps the most famous form of unarmed combat in the Star Wars universe was Teräs Käsi, an ancient martial art developed specifically as a means of fighting Jedi. Originally developed by the followers of Palawa on the planet of Bunduki, Teräs Käsi spread all over the galaxy and evolved as it did so, assimilating moves from the traditional styles of many species. What made Teräs Käsi stand out, however, was how it allowed non-force sensitives to go toe-to-toe with force users. The art enabled practitioners to develop extreme speed and, more importantly, anticipate the strikes of an opponent, which allowed average beings to overcome the inherent combat advantages of force users. Of course, the art was even deadlier when used by force users themselves. Darth Maul, in particular, was familiar with Teräs Käsi and incorporated it into lightsaber combat, as it worked well with Form 7. Teräs Käsi was fast-paced and heavy-hitting, putting both the strength and agility of combatants to use in equal measure. Most Teräs Käsi strikes were incredibly complicated and dealt several blows in one move, which made the art difficult to master. Those that could master it were considered among the deadliest unarmed combatants in the entire galaxy. In contrast to the aforementioned more elegant unarmed combat forms, Mandalorian combat styles were strength-based and focused primarily on brute force. Mandalorians were deadly and unsubtly so, and they were notorious for their preference for overwhelming force. The overwhelming force doctrine, which was readily apparent in Mandalorian weapon designs, warship designs, and battle tactics, was also quite evident in their forms of unarmed combat. However, that's not to say that the Mandalorian forms were all that simple or that they were without nuance. On the contrary, there was indeed a degree of tactical coordination and occasionally even precision in Mandalorian hand-to-hand combat. As in all things, Mandalorians were highly effective in unarmed combat. Their styles may not have had the subtlety or the precision that styles like Teräs Käsi and Akani had. Indeed, many Mandalorians preferred melee combat with both no weapons and with melee weapons to ranged combat, and this preference led to the development of specialized melee shields around the time of the Mandalorian Wars. Masters of the Mandalorian close combat styles like Jango Fett were capable of killing even Jedi with their bare hands. So, with that all said, what styles were clones trained in? The obvious answer would be the Mandalorian styles. After all, they were cloned from a Mandalorian who was evidently an expert in such combat forms, as Count Dooku stated that he killed Jedi on Galadriel barehanded. While this training likely only involved the basic elements of the form, it's possible that clone commandos, ARC troopers, and other, more skilled clones received further training in the style, especially considering the direct involvement of Mandalorians in their training. Considering the prolific nature of Ikani martial arts in the galaxy at large, it's a fair bet that at least a few clones were trained in them somewhat. Clones like Commander Cody, who displayed particular skill in unarmed combat, probably knew of at least the basic elements of Ikani fighting styles. We know for a fact that some clones, namely the clone assassins that participated in Operation Nightfall, were trained in Teräs Käsi, likely as a means of countering the abilities of their Jedi opponents. Obviously, there was a degree of variance in how skilled clones were in melee combat, and it's likely that some of the more proficient clones trained themselves in their spare time as a result. Compare, for example, the following clips. Knowing the Kaminoans, it's highly unlikely that the defective clone from the first clip was somehow trained less than the others, so he probably establishes a baseline for clone unarmed combat training, which is rather unfortunate. That said, Commander Cody demonstrates a good amount of proficiency in unarmed combat, likely in the Mandalorian styles, which may well have been something he learned from Alpha 17, an ARC trooper who was trained by Jango Fett himself. As a further example of Cody, as well as Captain Rex in melee combat, consider the following.
Traitor. You are! All of you just blindly following orders! For what? At least I got something out of all this suffering. Yeah, I bet you sold out your brothers for some real shiny coin, huh? Yes, she offered me money. But she offered me something more important. Something you wouldn't understand. Freedom!
This is more brawling than anything, but there are clear elements of Mandalorian unarmed combat here, which of course makes sense. Slick, evidently, was skilled in such styles to some degree as well, which hints towards a greater spread of Mandalorian styles among the clones, as we speculated earlier. This example of hand-to-hand is pretty unrefined, even for Mandalorian close combat, so it's not easy to analyze, but it's nonetheless a good example of how clones fought hand-to-hand when they had to. So that's our analysis of hand-to-hand combat in the Star Wars universe, but what do you think? Are there topics like this that you'd like to see covered in the future? Let me know in the comments section below. And as per usual guys, just before I go, there are a bunch of needy links in the description below needing your clicks. So if you want to join the Geetzleys Gaming Network and join us on Gmod and Roblox, as well as all of the Discord servers to talk with other Star Wars fans such as yourself, make sure you click that show more button in the description tab below, and I hope to see you there. Anyways, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.